Hello chemistry students, Mr. Schleicher here with another notes video. Today we're going to be learning about percent yield. So by the end of this lesson, we're going to learn what that is. What is percent yield? We are going to define a term called experimental yield. Some people also call that actual yield. They mean the same thing. We might talk about a few variables that can affect the experimental yield. And then finally, and most importantly, we are going to be able to calculate percent yield. As long as we have some sort of experimental yield, we will be able to do that. If not, then we can't. So what we already know is that our reactions are limited to the amount of reactants that we have. Because if we run out of one reactant, that stops the reaction, because all of your reactants have to be there for a reaction to occur. If a certain reaction runs out first, we call that the limiting reactant. And we had a whole procedure to calculate how to find that. So in a reaction in general, there are some limiting factors that can stop it from happening completely. Something to consider here is that your particles of chemicals, they actually have to physically collide with each other for a reaction to happen. And some chemists might say, well, they have to collide each other with enough energy and at the proper orientation for a reaction to happen. Now, this doesn't always happen 100%, so reactions almost never reach 100% of their theoretical yield or their maximum amount of product that you can make. So let's look at this beaker here, this black and white beaker with all of these different molecules in there. And let's say that if we combine one of these white atoms and then add it to one of these black atoms, and they like physically collide, and maybe they form a now bonded black and white atom molecule. So let this be our reaction in our beaker. So in this picture above, why does this reaction not go to completion? It looks like there's one black atom on the bottom left and a white one on the top right, and I'm guessing they're too far apart from each other. The atoms are too far apart to actually collide, and if they can't get to each other, then a reaction is just not going to happen. Now, there's some other factors other than not being physically close to each other that can affect reaction completion. I'm just going to talk about a few of them briefly here. For example, temperature. If there's not enough temperature, then a reaction might not happen. Some reactions only happen at cold temperatures, but some reactions, like catching things on fire, only happen at hot temperatures. Sometimes reactions don't really happen unless you have a catalyst. For example, the reason why things taste sweet in your mouth is because a reaction happens that breaks down carbs into simple sugars because of a catalyst, an enzyme in your saliva. Another thing that can affect reaction completion, like how complete will the reaction be, is the medium of your reaction. So are you performing your reaction in this like well-spun mixture of water where all your molecules can collide really easily? Or maybe you are trying to make your reaction in this goo and nothing can really mix well, and then your reactants aren't really able to collide with each other. That can really affect your reaction completion here. And speaking of that, what kind of product that reaction forms can stop the reaction from happening more. So like, for example, maybe in some polymer chemistry lab, you're trying to develop some sort of gel or goo, and you make some of it, but then the gel or goo that you form stops the rest of the reactants from reacting with each other because they just get stuck. So that product stopped. It inhibited the reaction from happening further. Another example of this is basically every single homeostasis pathway in your body, all those chemical reactions keeping you healthy. Normally, they don't go all the way to completion, or else you'd probably die. Normally, some sort of product that they make stops the reaction from going on too much. So let's talk about percent yield. It's the whole point of this lesson, after all. What is it? Well, it's a measure of the completion of reaction, or the percentage of the theoretical yield of the products that were actually made in your reaction. It's going to be a number, it's going to be a percent, and that means that we will be able to calculate this. So how do we calculate it? You can think of it as this little 5-step procedure, but basically you approach it the same way every single time. You always need a balanced chemical equation, first of all. Now, I will say most problems will probably just give that to you already. So step 1, done, easy peasy. Second of all, you have to identify your limiting reactant. So you got to figure that out, because the limiting reactant is the number one thing that tells you how much product that you will actually make. So using your limiting reactant, and by the way, we learned how to do this step and the next step in the last note, so review those if you totally forgot this. Using your limiting reactant, you have to calculate the maximum amount of product that you could possibly produce. And another name for that was the theoretical yield of your reaction. Definitely calculate this in amount of grams. So you're probably going to have to use a molar mass somewhere in there in order to find that. Then, if you're in a lab, what you're going to do is you're going to measure the grams of product that you actually produce. Now, often, we're not going to be in a lab, so a lot of word problems just give you this number. They're like, hey, we measured 2 grams were produced. And you'll have the number that way of the actual yield. So we are calling this actual yield, the amount of grams actually produced. Finally, how do you figure out that percent yield? Well, a percentage of anything is just like the part of an amount over the total amount. So in this case, it's the actual yield, like the part that was actually formed, over the part that could have formed, the entire chemical amount that could have formed. So you do 100% times actual over theoretical, and you should get your percent yield. So for example, over here, just thinking about this, if in theory I could produce, let's say 2 grams of product, but then in my lab, I measured that I only made 1 gram of product. What is the percent yield? Well, in that case, you do 1 divided by 2, and your percent yield will be 50%. All right. There's just going to be 2 example of problems here. For best learning results, I recommend you just try them out first before you continue in the video. So pause now, try them out, and I'm going to continue this already. Let's refer to the following chemical equation to answer this question, just right there. Looks pretty simple. All the coefficients are 1, so that's going to make things really easy for us. Now, 1,500 grams of Zn is available to react with 210 grams of CuSO4. The solid amount, or the amount of solid Cu produced in this reaction, is measured to be 70 grams. What is the percent yield of this reaction? Okay, so we had this whole procedure from before. If you're just going by that procedure, the first step was make sure you have a balanced chemical equation. So I'm going to say 1. There's our balanced chemical equation. We have that. It gave it to us. The second thing we needed to do was find our limiting reactant. So to find the limiting reactant, you have to take the amount of each reactant, make sure you have the moles of each reactant, and then get the moles to moles of your reaction by dividing by the coefficient. Whatever number is lower, it's going to be your limiting reactant. So let's do that really quick. Let's see, 1,500 grams of zinc. I need moles of zinc, so I'm going to convert that there. If you look at your periodic table, it looks like the molar mass of zinc is 65.38 grams of zinc. Put that on bottom, so now that's canceled. And that's in every 1 mole of zinc. Now, I got to figure out, what is the ratio of this being used up in my reaction. So I'm going to convert this to moles of reactions. It looks like in every single reaction, there's just one of these ZN. So I'm going to say 1 mole of ZN for every 1 mole of reaction. And then I could just calculate this. Let's see, 1,500 divided by 65.38. I got 23 moles of reactions that could be kind of powered up by the amount of zinc that we have. Okay, one more reactant to check out. We have this 210 grams of CuSO4, copper 2 sulfate, if you're interested in that name. And since we have grams, the first thing we need to do is find the number of moles of substance, because grams isn't actually very useful here. So if you calculate the molar mass of that, let's see, copper plus sulfur plus 4 of these oxygens, I'm getting a molar mass of 159.61 grams of CuSO4. So grams of CuSO4 cancels out, and that's how many grams of CuSO4 that we have in 1 mole of CuSO4. And then last step, just got to make sure that we figured out the mole ratio of that to the moles of reaction. So in every 1 mole of reaction, it looks like there's just 1 CuSO4 that gets used up. Problem here, and let's see, 210 divided by 159.61, I got around 1.3 moles of reaction for the calculation there. Okay, so you got to ask yourself, what number is lower? What's my limiting reactant? And I got that CuSO4 is limiting. I mean, you just look at it, like 1.3 is obviously less than 23, so that corresponds to CuSO4, which means that was our limiting reactant. Okay, next step of our procedure here is when we found our limiting reactant, now we need to calculate our theoretical yield. So make sure we're calculating our theoretical yield. And the shortcut I like to do, starting with the amount of limiting reactant, is I like to just use the number of reactions that we solved for. So 1.3 moles of reaction, and go straight to the product that we're looking for from there. In this case, it looks like we're looking for a solid Cu product, so I'm going to go straight there. Percent yield, normally we deal with grams, so the goal here is to get to grams of Cu, grams of copper here. So setting up this dimensional analysis, we're starting with moles of reaction, just got that from over there. So in each 1 mole of reaction, I'm going to look at Cu. It looks like there's just one of these Cus. So I'm going to say 1 mole of Cu. Moles of reaction cancel out. Now I got to think, I'm looking for grams of Cu. So I know in each 1 mole of Cu, the molar mass is, according to our periodic table, 63.55 grams of Cu. Canceling out the moles there. Excuse me. Now we can calculate this. 1.3 times that 63.55 should get us 83 grams of Cu or so. So this is our theoretical yield of Cu that can be produced from this reaction. If every single particle of every single chemical that we have was able to react to completion, that is what we get. Now, we know that in general, that is not always the case. It's pretty much never the case. So we are going to calculate the percent yield here. So if you were following the procedure from before, it says step 4 is to figure out the actual yield. They gave it to us. They said 70 grams of Cu is actually produced. So step 4 is done. And the last step of our procedure was to calculate our percent yield. Now, that is super easy. All we gotta do is use our formula from before, the actual yield in grams over the theoretical yield in grams times 100% to figure out the percentage there is equal to our answer. So they gave us the number 70 grams of copper. We calculated that in theory, 83 grams of copper could be formed. Divide that, times it by 100%, and I got 84% yield as the percent yield of this reaction that occurred. Excuse me, I was drinking water. All right, last question here. After reviewing chemistry research journals, very common occurrence in college actually, you come across a method for the combustion of propane. So C3H8 with a 93% yield for experimentally captured carbon dioxide. Okay, sure. The method used the chemical equation shown below. What mass of carbon dioxide will be captured when 200 grams of C3H8 is combusted in 1 times 10 to the 5th grams of oxygen? Excuse me. Very interesting question. Okay, I'm just going to rush through the gist of this because it seems like my throat is killing me. We have our balanced chemical equation. That's good. It looks like we have amounts of both reactants, so I'm already thinking, gotta find that limiting reactant. And it has this really interesting scenario where we're looking for some amount that was actually made, if we can assume that 93% of it will be made from that theoretical yield. So let's try to calculate the theoretical yield of CO2 and then use that percentage to find the actual yield of CO2. A very uncommon scenario, but it is one way that we can ask this question. So first, let's find that limiting reactant. So we were given 200 grams of C3H8. Since we start with grams, it's always pretty good to convert that to moles. I got 44.10 grams of C3H8 in each mole of C3H8, just adding up the 3 carbons and the 8 hydrogens. So the grams cancel there. And now just got to figure out the ratio to reactions that is. Now it looks like there's just one of these C3H8, so I'm going to say 1 mole of C3H8 for every 1 mole of reaction. Moles of C3H8 cancels out. I'm left with, let's say, 200 divided by 44.10 is equal to, I'm getting around 4.54 moles of reaction here. And other reactant we got to look at here. Let me make some space. We were given 1 times 10 to the 5th grams of oxygen, or O2. So got to figure out the moles there. First of all, that sounds like a lot of O2. Normally that's the case in the world around us. Whenever we have some sort of combustion, there's plenty of oxygen in the air and not that much stuff that you're burning. But let's double check to make sure, see if oxygen is actually that much in excess. So 32.00 grams of O2 in 1 mole of O2. Don't forget it's O2 because it's part of Brinkelhoff. And those grams of O2 cancel out. Now, looking at the reaction here, I know I'm just circling random things. It looks like we have 5 moles of O2 in every 1 mole of reaction. So that's actually going to be important here, or maybe not. So 1 times 10 to the 5th divided by 32 divided by 5 in the calculator, I'm getting around 625 moles of reaction. Okay, so what is our limiting reactant? I'm saying this one, we got way less of a number here, 4.54 moles of reaction. So let's say that C3H8 is limiting. So now that we found our limiting reactant, let's find our theoretical yield based on that amount of reactant. I like to always start, so find that theoretical yield. I like to always start with this moles of reaction that we calculated. It's shorter, so 5.54 moles of reaction. And then in every 1 reaction here, let's see, what are we even looking for? It looks like we are looking for carbon dioxide. We're talking about carbon dioxide, the yield of that. So carbon dioxide is CO2. And in this 1 mole of reaction, it looks like there's 3 CO2s. So I'm going to say 3 moles of CO2 there. Moles of reaction cancel out. When you're calculating theoretical yield, normally you got to convert it all the way to grams. So let's do one more conversion. In every 1 mole of CO2, let's see, I calculated 44.01 grams of CO2 as the molar mass. So if we calculate this, 4.54 times 3 times 44.01, I got around 599 grams of CO2 as our theoretical yield of CO2. So the final part of the question it was asking us is, what is the mass of carbon dioxide that will be captured if there's like a 93% capture yield or rate or whatever? So let's use percent yield here. To calculate, I guess, the actual yield of CO2 here, or at least the actual yield that was captured. Excuse me. All right, so it looks like we have 599 grams of CO2. Now, if we're looking for an amount that's just 93% of that, then this is actually a really, really easy calculation. Finding 93% of something is just moving the decimal over 2 times. So I'm going to multiply this by 0.93. So times 0.93, 599 times 0.93 should get you 557 grams of CO2 as your actual yield here, or just captured in general, according to the scenario presented by the question. Okay, I think that's all I had for y'all. Hopefully that helped teach y'all what percent yield was, how to calculate that. If you have any questions, please ask your teacher or just Google how to calculate percent yield.